Hello everybody, welcome back to our virtual classroom and another lesson in our trades training video series. I'm Joe Carswell, and this lesson is all about the basic process of sanding with different tools and materials. I want to thank Benjamin Moore for providing the funding that's allowed us to make these videos. Let me start by saying this video is going to cover the basic sanding materials and process to do a simple residential wall surface, maybe some trim as well. There's a whole world of other processes and materials. It could be when we get into hardwoods, to finishing with clear coats, to different kind of special fillers. All of these things require specific processes and a different consideration than we're going over here. This video covers just the basics, so let's get right into it. There's a lot of reasons why we sand in this painting process. One is to help the paint to stick. If the surface is too smooth, the paint won't adhere. We're also adding fillers to fill in dents or low spots. Those fillers are going to need to be sanded. We might have high spots, and our sanding is going to flatten those out too. At the end, we want a job that looks good, and sanding is a really important step in that process. Specifically, if we're talking about that process, we're talking about a primer that's going to go on early, and we want to sand before the primer. Even after the primer is going to show us all these defects. They're going to start to appear. That's going to bring us to a plan of sanding, possibly fillers. And even in our finished stages or top coats of paint, we're going to sand in between those to promote adhesion of follow-up coats and just to make the job look better. A couple of categories of sanding or methods of sanding are going to be hand sanding, that's simply by hand, or it's going to be power sanding. This is where we'll bring in power tools to get the job done. One thing to mention is that hand sanding would be a very slow and fine and detailed process, and power sanding tends to be more production oriented. If we have a larger job or a very large surface to do, we'd probably bring out the power tools, not unlike other methods of working or building in construction. When we're talking about grit on sandpaper, the small ones are going to be called fine and the large ones are going to be called coarse. What you're going to find is on a piece of sandpaper, they're all going to be very similar sizes, and each sandpaper is going to be rated for how rough or how smooth it is. And you can actually feel this on this sandpaper. A fine sandpaper is going to feel much less rough than a coarse grade. And it's important to understand there's a lot of different steps from very fine to very coarse. We're going to go over that a little bit later, but let's look at this abrasive up close. If we look at this sandpaper even closer under a microscope as in this presentation, you see that this abrasive is very sharp points that are glued or fastened to this backing. As this sandpaper travels over a surface, as we move it over a surface, it's going to cut through or remove the material on the surface that we're trying to work. We can put these sandpapers in categories or ranges, and you're looking at 60 to 80 being a coarse grit. This would be for heavy material removal. A medium range is going to be anywhere from say 100 to 150. Beyond 150, you're getting into fine sanding, and this is going to be light material removal, smoothing out things. And as I mentioned before, the numbers can get really high, and with the higher numbers comes the finer grit and the less material removed. You'll find these numbers on the backing of every piece of sandpaper. You see here, this is 150 grit, so this would be for a light surface sanding, a high side of medium range. Here we've got a 60 grit, and I'm feeling it's very rough. So look at the rating of the sandpaper and make sure that you're consistently choosing the right grit for whatever you're sanding. Your abrasive or grit is going to be attached to a backing. There's a few types of backings to talk about. One is going to be a paper backing. The benefit of a paper backing is very common, it's not expensive, and it has this benefit of being able to be folded. And when we fold it, we now have an edge that's also abrasive. This comes in handy when we're hand sanding. You might see a cloth-backed piece of sandpaper. This is going to be a very durable and flexible version, not common for hand sanding, used on some power tools that we're not going to get into today. Or you might see a film backing. This one has a hook and loop on the back, which is basically Velcro, which allows it to be stuck onto a power sanding machine very easily, so it can be attached and removed and replaced. Another version of sandpaper to mention that will be used in this process is a sanding sponge. So we're taking that abrasive and we're attaching it to a sponge, literally. So this sponge is coated with grit or abrasive of a specific size, and we can choose the size for whatever job we're doing. It also has a shape to it that has a wedge. This allows us to work details. So it's good for large surfaces. It's going to have some give to it, but it will remove some high spots. Synthetic wool is a sanding material that is generally used for very fine sanding. This is a plastic mesh with abrasive attached to it. These don't clog up like some of, for instance, this sanding sponge. You see the material starting to close in. That makes this sanding sponge not work as well. Our synthetic steel wool, or Scotch-Brite, you might hear it called, is open weave, and the abrasive is in there. So this is not going to clog up as fast. These come in different grades of abrasive as well. They're generally used for dulling out surfaces. So if you have a shiny surface, as we mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, that those shiny surfaces are not going to take paint very well. So we can dull them out so that we can have that better adhesion of our paint. Sanding screens are a version of sandpaper, but they're a special version that we use if we have this clogging problem. So I mentioned this sanding sponge and how it clogs. A sanding screen is an open weave, so the abrasive is attached to it. Now the dust and whatever fillers you're sanding are not going to clog that up. This type of sanding screen will last a lot longer than just a typical paper-backed sandpaper. We talked about hand sanding. One version of that is freehand sanding. So we can do that. I want to demonstrate it here. And basically that is a simple process of having a piece of paper-backed sandpaper of whatever grit you need to get the job done. This is 150, and I have a piece of, I believe this is mahogany here. I'm going to smooth this piece out. My goal is to make it smoother, but not so smooth that it can't accept a coat, a clear coat on it. So hand sanding is just a simple method of moving the sandpaper back and forth on the piece, and it's traveling with the grain, and the grain of this piece is the length of the board. So that is going to happen very slowly and very deliberately. Hand sanding is a detailed process, and it requires us to not only pay attention to what we're doing, choose the right sandpaper, but also work the surfaces in a specific direction. Whenever you're on a sharp edge or somewhere like this edge here, you're going to sand it only as much as you need. If you sand too far or dig in too hard, or you're too aggressive, then it's very difficult to get that back or to fix that later. It's very often we're working with trim, and trim has a lot of lines and details to it. This is going to come into play there. When you have those edges, keep in mind when you're sanding that you're not bearing down really hard on those lines. Once you remove them, you can ruin something that has been put in place, and then it would have to be replaced. It's really often that we're sanding flat surfaces. And when we're sanding flat surfaces, freehand sanding might not be the best process. A lot of times we're looking for high spots, and any kind of flat surface that we put between the sandpaper and the surface that we're sanding, if we can put a plane or a block between the sandpaper and that surface, we can now turn it into a tool that's going to find high spots. We're going to apply more pressure to the high spot than to any other part of that pad surface, and it's going to knock those high spots down. It's really hard to do that when we're freehand sanding without backing behind it. So the backing of, say, this sanding block, which is a rubber sanding block, or this hand sander, which accepts sheets of sandpaper, either one of those are going to work the same way. We're going to pass it over the surface. It's going to find these high spots. It's going to knock them down. The result of that is going to be a flatter surface. Here's a perfect example of that happening. I was sanding out some filler on this wall yesterday. Let's look at that clip. I'm getting ready to prime this wall, and I've got a few tools here I would use to check for defects, make some final last-minute corrections before I go through that process. Priming is going to pull out a lot of the defects, but if I can see some before then and correct them, then I'm that much further ahead. So I might just have a piece of sandpaper. A lot of this is as much about feel as it is about the sanding process or flattening it. So I'm feeling, looking for places, and wherever I have a change of material here, I'm just going to hit it really quick. And I'm looking for a really hard change in color to a very soft change in color. Not a heavy, aggressive process, just a swipe with a piece of sandpaper. You might use a sanding sponge. This one is going to give you a little bit more of a flat surface, and we can also just pass it over the surface really lightly. And my edges here are turning very soft. That's going to translate into a paint job to being a very flat appearing surface. And really, ideally, you'd be doing this with one hand feeling the wall. So I'm looking, it's almost more than about feel than appearance. And you'll find the spots with your hand as you feel it. So this process will continue over this entire wall, any area that we're getting ready to prime. Keep in mind, whenever you pull out a piece of sandpaper and you are doing any sanding of filler or drywall mud or anything like that, you are sending very, very fine dust everywhere in the air. So now we're talking about breathing it. We need to consider a dust mask that we're wearing. I'm in my classroom here. I get to do what I want, but I have a shop vac right behind me. And as you can see, look at the dust that has fallen to the floor here just from a few light passes with my sanding sponge. And keep in mind, that's also now suspended in the air. And also this dust is traveling all through the room. So when you're painting, this is a matter of we need to control this. That's going to be in the form of floor protection. It's going to be curtain walls. It's going to be constant cleaning and prepping this area to keep it clean. Also keep in mind this dust is going to end up on every other surface, and we're going to have to clean this wall and any trim before we can paint it. I've got my primer on the wall. Now I've coated it. Any defects that I didn't catch before the primer are definitely going to show up in this phase. I've got a hand sander here and I've got a piece of sandpaper on it. This is a nice flat surface that I can wander around on this wall. I'm feeling for defects. I'm finding little small spots that I can run this over. And the beauty of a hand sander or any kind of surface sander like this is going to be that this large flat surface is going to typically float over the surface, and any of the high spots, it's going to find them and you can knock them down. I've got a whole wall to do here, and at this point we need to look for details. We're looking for problems. If we find them now, we're not going to have these issues later in our finish steps. I'm going to hit this and I'll get back to you later. So as you noticed, I was using these tools on our wall here in my sanding process. If you're doing a small area, that works fine. And this wall, it was perfectly fine to use these hand tools. If you're doing a larger area, say production work, and you're a painter, you're doing a whole house, this isn't going to cut it. You're going to need larger tools. And a pole sander is going to be a larger production tool that you're going to use. You're going to graduate to this, and now we have to understand our sanding tools and get the feel for this, because you're putting a pole in between you and this sanding block that you're sanding with. Could be a rectangular one very similar to this, or it could be a round version that's a lot more popular these days. That pad that's on that surface is separated from you by this pole. It's going to require a lot more skill, and you've lost the direct contact or feel of that surface. So now you need to know a lot more about what you're doing, have a lot more experience, and a lot more errors can occur with these tools. So make sure that you practice and get the feel for them. A step up from a pole sander is going to be a power pole sander. Now we're taking this idea of a pole, extension pole and a pad, and we're making a power tool out of it. This tool is going to come equipped with a vacuum system that's going to pull all the dust through it. It's also going to have a spinning or rotating disc on it that is going to make this sander even work more quickly and remove more material. And this tool is a super production tool. You can make a huge mess with one of these, and you can grind straight through your material that you've added and then have to start all over with. Let's look at a couple other power tools you would use for sanding, starting with an orbital sander. This is a simple power tool that's going to use a very small circular motion to sand with. We're going to attach a piece of sandpaper to a rubber pad here, and then we can turn it on. It's going to vibrate, or what feels like it's vibrating, and it's going to remove material with that small circular motion. A different version of this would be a detail sander. And a detail sander is going to be the same motion, but the pad is shaped in a specific way that helps it work in small areas and on specific details. One thing, or a drawback about this type of sander, is that it will work on something as long as it's not too small. These are going to be very difficult when we get to edges and into tight spaces. A detail sander is going to take the action of this sander and work it into those small spaces. Next up, I have a random orbital sander. And a random orbital sander is going to take a round disc. It's going to take that orbital motion of this guy, and it's going to combine it with a rotation of this disc at the same time. We'll look at what that does to the sanding pattern next, but let me show you these pads. These are Velcro pads, and they're going to stick onto this just like that. So we can change the pad that simply. And you're doing a lot of pad changes because the sandpaper is going to wear out. Also, it has some holes in it that if you attach a vacuum system to this, it's going to pull the dust through the machine and away from your surface. This helps with this process of sanding. The dust bag on this will also collect some of that dust. It's also going to pull it up through these holes. It doesn't work as well as the vacuum system, but you're often emptying this dust bag, so it must be working. I love these close-ups of these sanding patterns. If you see the one on the left, it demonstrates a typical orbital sander in motion, and it looks like very squiggly straight lines. And this sander is being pulled in a straight line, both of them are. And the random orbital sander on the right shows you how much more thoroughly it's sanding that surface. They're both probably traveling at the same speed. Look at how much more sanding action you get out of the random orbital sander. So in summary, you're getting a more aggressive sander, you're getting a more thorough sander, and you're also getting a smoother finish from this particular power tool. So if I was comparing the two, I might consider this one in situations where I needed any of those aspects to happen. It's really important when we're sanding that we do it in an organized and logical way. We need a strategy when we're sanding a surface so that we don't neglect certain areas or overwork other areas. When we're sanding, we can actually create more damage than we're trying to fix. And remember, you're removing material, and that we have this habit as people to sometimes work in areas that we're really comfortable. If it's on a wall, it might be an area that's right here where I'm not either bending or reaching. This area tends to get worked very nicely. But don't forget, there's areas up here where you have to reach to or bend down to that are just as important. On this presentation, you see a floor that's been sanded, and around this outlet in the floor, there is obvious neglect in the sanding process. There was some rough sanding that happened early, but the finish or fine sanding was neglected around this area because the tools that we're using don't necessarily work around those easy. So don't be lazy when you're sanding. Have a plan and be thorough and very focused on the entire area, not just the easy parts. Another strategy to think of is sanding with the grain. So if you consider that the process of sanding is making scratches, we want those scratches to be deliberate and thorough and look good when we're done. They might be very small scratches, but they're still scratches. So a good strategy to use, especially when we're sanding wood, is sanding with the grain. I mentioned that earlier, and that means that we need to understand the grain of the wood. A really easy way to remember that is most pieces of trim or boards, the grain runs in the long direction of the board. So if we're sanding in the long direction, generally we're going to be following this rule and doing a better job of it. Be super easy on your edges. This is going to be the most fragile part of the surface that you're working on. If it's been painted, you'll knock that paint off really quick if you're hard on those edges. And those edges need to stay sharp. That's where all of your detail and where the aesthetics are coming from, especially when you're talking about trim, if you're talking about cabinet doors. All of these features have these hard edges. Once those edges are gone, you can't get them back. There's no amount of filler or paint coats that's going to return that to original. So keep that in mind, be easy on these edges, and use that as part of your strategy. Let's take all these tools, materials, and ideas about sanding and put them together. I've got a shutter here, and we're going to work through all of that on this particular piece. I've got a lot going on this shutter here. I've got a lot of details and areas, and we're going to have to come up with a plan. We're doing a recoat here, so I'm just doing a simple just sanding prep before we recoat it. I've got a lot of different angles and edges. I've got a lot of different parts. So we can bring in this idea of flat surfaces, how we're going to sand those. We also have grain of wood that we have to consider. And all of these parts and pieces, the grain is going to run in the long dimension of the piece. So for my sides, it's going to be, the grain's going to run this direction on both my sides. My grain's going to run this direction on my stiles. And also I have all my slats. All my grain is running in this direction. When I'm sanding, I have to consider that. I have all my edges that I want to preserve. That's what's going to make this look good in the end. And let's talk about tools here. This particular hand sander is really too large of a surface to sand anything here, but I do like the fact that it has a flat surface. I need a smaller version. That would be our sanding sponge. And this is going to be a great tool to use on all of these flat surfaces. It's not going to make too much of a mess or damage, but it's going to get us to where we need to be on our flat surfaces. It's also going to work into a lot of these tight spaces where nothing else will. So this edge or beveled part of this sanding sponge will work great in here on these slats, every single one of them. And I have some paint drips in here that I'm trying to deal with. I can also turn this sponge this way, and that width works really well in here. And I can work each one of these. When we're talking about having a plan, start from one end and work down. Don't neglect any part of this shutter. And this also works on the edges. So when we're talking about these edges of this particular shutter, I'll sand this, and I'm sanding hard on that edge. We're going to work all the edges, and even the back here will prime that as well. And that's sort of your prep process. If you wanted to do some of this with a power sander, maybe you have 30 shutters you're trying to do, it wouldn't be a bad idea to pull out something like your random orbital sander, and you can work it on here. The problem with a power sander is you're going to have to avoid your edges completely with this tool, so you can't be moving it or rocking it over those edges, and it will only work on these flat surfaces, which would be through here, possibly through here, here, and here. None of these slats would be able to be done with this particular type of tool. Let's do a quick sanding review. Two methods of sanding are hand sanding, used for more delicate and detail work, and machine sanding, used for larger area production jobs. Sandpapers come in different grits, that's coarse to fine, and you should choose the right sandpaper based on what effect you're trying to get, how much material you're trying to remove, and how large the surface is, and what type of surface. Power tools can speed up your sanding process. Sanding creates respiratory hazards by releasing airborne pollutants from the materials you're sanding. That's in the form of dust in your lungs. Proper PPE should be worn, and knowledge of these materials and surfaces that you're sanding is really important. Here we are at the end of our sanding video. I did not get a chance to show you sanding trim, but as far as the shutter goes, the process is pretty much the same. You're working over a very irregular or detailed surface with a hand sanding process. So I hope you've learned something about this very important step in the painting process that requires us to use specific materials, to remove specific amounts of material, and to do it in a way that improves our paint process in the end. So thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next lesson. Some of the images in this presentation were found on the internet, and this is a list of their sources. This video is a production of Trade Skills U, all rights reserved. If you provide instruction in the construction trades and have a need for videos like these, please contact us at tradeskillsu.com.